I just got to tell you, Daniel, excellent job, seriously. Just got to tell you, this is Brandon, one of our pastors, and he is going to share the word today. You're in for a treat.
Quick little announcement too with the children's ministry. There's going to be some renovations being done in those classrooms. So for the next 2 weeks, we'll actually be meeting over in the donut room. So if you have children in the church and you need to pick them up, just know that you can just go straight to the donut room and that's where they'll be for you. Cool. But I guess renovations are going to be pretty good, so that's awesome. You know, I wanted to start with a joke again today, but the only jokes that I have are bad dad jokes from winter camp. And that's not even good. I purposely set those jokes up to embarrass our students. So that's why I can't do that, because although they are in the back, so maybe I will embarrass them a little bit today. And then you guys can tell me if I've reached dad level yet. Because you guys are parents, I'm not a parent yet, so I still gotta learn these things before I have kids. Like, I gotta get to that level. But I have so many. I literally have, over the past 7 years of winter camp, I just keep adding to the list, but I have 21 bad dad jokes on here. I feel like some of them are decent. But remember, the goal is that they're awful. I want to embarrass them. I want them to go, that's not my leader. He's not our youth leader. But let's see here. Which one should I choose? A lot of it's in the delivery, but I just don't have the energy for a good delivery today. Winter camp got me. It did. But here's one. When does a joke become a dad joke? When it becomes a parent. There you go. All right, that's all I can give. Otherwise, I'm going to embarrass myself, and I don't want to embarrass myself today. Just a little bit. But I'm good for another 20 weeks. So if I get to speak again, I have another 20 dad jokes, which is awesome. But today we're going to continue our series. This will be part 4 in practical evangelism. Next week, I believe we're finishing up. It'll be part 5 with Dawn. Today we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 9, 19 through 23. And you guys should have a handout. I like to do these things. It helps me too in the process of preparing it. I can go through it a little bit easier. And hopefully it helps you guys follow along a little bit too. But if not, you did it anyway. It'll also be up on the screen for us, the verses up there. And then if you have a Bible, you can open up so you guys have plenty of options today. But let's go ahead and read this together. And by together, I know I've had this in the past. I'm just going to read it. You don't have to read with me, but just kind of read it in your mind. But it says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. And this right here, this next part is really where we're going to focus. And really, Daniel, when he got up here, preached my whole message, so I don't even really need to say this, but I'm going to anyway, because I prepared it. But it says, I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. And we're really going to focus on that part right there. And we're going to explore today the question, what does it look like to become all things to all people? And to do that, we're going to look at this passage, but we're also going to look at the life of Paul, and we're going to look at the life of Daniel. I think those two guys explain this verse to us very, very well. So the goal that we can see in this passage too, Paul makes it very clear, is he's becoming all things to all men, that people might enter into a relationship with Jesus. He's not doing it to be cool or trendy. He's doing it because he wants to introduce people to Jesus. And so that's our goal as we learn to do this as well. So as we look at this, I want to make it very clear. One thing that we see from this passage, just this first part, and this is the first one on your notes here as well if you have it, but our goal and what he's doing here is he's teaching us to sacrifice our preferences for the purposes of the kingdom. So what we're doing when we're becoming all things to all men is we're learning to put our purpose above our preference. The things that we might like to do, the things that we might have a preference for, we're learning to submit to the purpose of what we're trying to reach. And Paul here is to lead people to Jesus. And sometimes that does mean doing things we may not like. And we'll see, and we're going to look at Paul here, and he explains that and shows that in a few different ways that I really like. And I do want to make this very clear real quick too, is when we're putting our purpose over our preference, it doesn't mean we're losing ourselves. We're not losing who we are. We're not losing our truest identity. But what's happening is we're choosing consciously in freedom. It's a free choice to place the things that we might prefer for the sake of removing things that would hinder the gospel being heard. It's strategic and it's a powerful choice. It's not, I'm losing myself. Sorry, my nose is super stuffy, so if that bugs you, I'm so sorry. Winter camp really did get me. It's not 7th year Dylan. I thought I would get used to it by now, but I did not. The lack of sleep. But we're going to look at Paul now because Paul actually talks about this idea quite a bit. So we're going to look at Romans first, and we're going to 2 Corinthians. This will be a little different than the last time I saw it. We're going to be kind of jumping around from text to text. But this one's going to be Romans 14, 13 through 15. It should be up on the screen for you. And it says, but just a little context to you, what's happening here is these guys are kind of arguing over what they're allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. So in their specific context, it's with food. They're like, I can eat this. No, you can't eat this. This is allowed. No, this is not allowed. And so Paul jumps in here and explains this a little bit. And he says, therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. I'm convinced, being fully persuaded in the Lord Jesus, that nothing is unclean in itself. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for that person it is unclean. If your brother or sister is distressed because of what you eat, you are no longer acting in love. Do not by your eating destroy someone for whom Christ died. And the reason I really like this verse too is Paul actually is even saying, even if you're right, because maybe Paul liked a good pork sandwich, but these guys are saying, no, I can't have that. That's not cool. So what he's doing is he's saying, even if I prefer that, even if I really want that, he's saying, if I keep doing it and it's a stumbling block for people to receive what Jesus wants to do in their lives, then I'm no longer acting in love. And so what he's saying, again, is I need to put the purpose of Jesus being able to access people's hearts above my preference of having specific foods in this context. But it's that purpose over our preference. And again, in 2 Corinthians, one thing that I thought was really cool that Paul did is, and he actually even, a little preface, I guess, 1 Corinthians, he says that a worker's worth his wages. You guys remember that? And what happens in 2 Corinthians is he says, I purposely didn't take money from you guys, even though they know that he's worth his money. But he says, I didn't take money from you guys because I knew that if I did, you wouldn't listen to what I had to say. And he even goes on to say that I actually became a burden to the Macedonians because it didn't hurt them. They were willing to give that money so that you guys could hear it. And so he's willing to sacrifice even having money in some ways so that he could remove all stumbling blocks out of the way. Anything that would get in the way, he's willing to move. And what he does is anything that's in the way of people hearing or responding and receiving the gospel, he is moving out of the way. And I think what Paul learned is that becoming all things to all men is learning to love people and honor people. It's learning to capture people's hearts so that we can influence them into a place of leading them to Jesus. And so I think what Paul really learned is that in order to gain the necessary influence, the place in people's hearts and lives that we can lead them to Jesus, we have to enter through the doors of love and honor. And only through love and honor can we actually influence people's lives in the ways that we want to. It's to love, and we learned in Romans there, it's to prefer others before ourselves. It's to place others in submit what we want so that we can prefer others to receive Jesus. It's meeting people where they're at. And so to honor people, to do what Paul is doing is to put aside what we want sometimes and what we might prefer. And I'm going to go into that a little bit more, but I want to share a little bit of a story here. It was when we first went to Mexico. And you guys have heard Caitlin go to Mexico quite a bit. I've actually only done once, but we met this guy named Mario, who we're still really good friends with. And Mario, one thing that he was sharing was his past experience with missionaries. And quite frankly, he hated missionaries. Because what would happen is missionaries would come into Mexico, and they wouldn't ask any questions. They would just come in and say, this is what you're doing. They would begin giving them all the answers before they asked any questions. And so what happened, though, is they began answering questions that were never asked. They were answering things that didn't need to be answered. There was no need for the things that they were doing. And so Mario, I remember, said to me, and it was very practical, but it felt so much deeper to me too, is he said, if you want to have an impact here, you need to learn to speak the language of the people. And in a very practical sense, he was saying you need to learn to speak Spanish. But hearing his background, his stories with the missionaries who had hurt them, really what he's saying too is you need to be able to understand what we're about as a people. You need to understand what we care about, the needs we have, the concerns, because unfortunately, it was American missionaries coming in saying this is how you're supposed to do it in a completely different culture. And it didn't translate. That's not how it worked. And so again, the key to influence and impact is always through honor and love. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, are we willing to put aside our preferences so that we can actually have a kingdom impact? Are we willing to do that? And so as we look at this, and this is the next part on your notes here, I want to take a look at culture, because what is culture? If we want to speak the language of a culture, we have to first understand what culture even is. So what I did here is I put 3 different components of culture. Now, this isn't exhaustive. There's so many different things that go into creating culture, but these are just 3. And I want to say to you that culture is both broad and it's specific. So culture can be broad in that you go to a different country, it has a completely different culture, right? You would go to even Mexico, and it's what you would call a collectivistic culture, which all that means is that you're putting the group before the individual. Whereas in America, you might notice we really highly value the individual. And that's not bad, that's an individualistic culture. But there's so much to be gained from both, and that's a whole different topic altogether. I studied communication in college, and so intercultural communication was super fun for me as you learn all these things. But then it can also be specific. Culture is also specific in that even a different music genre would contain in itself a completely different culture. I would think of reggae versus like metal music, right? The way those people express themselves would be completely different. The way they dress, the way they talk, what they do, all those different things will express themselves differently, and it's a completely different subculture, if you will. And so as we look at these, the first one here of these components of culture would be language. Right, that's number 1 on there, language. Each culture has its own language. And though language is verbal, it's not always verbal. There's nonverbal language as well. It's nonverbal communication. So how we dress is even a form of communication. Again, you look at how someone who's a fan of reggae dresses, it's going to be very, very different than someone who's into metal music. Right? How we express ourselves with hairstyles, tattoos, accessories, all these things are ways in which we communicate. They express the culture that we carry and identify with. The second one is going to be norms. And I keep going back to this because I think it is such a different thing, but if you go to a concert for one of these 2, even that alone will be very different. If you go to a reggae concert, it's going to be very different. You may see people smoking things that you don't like smoking. They're going to be wearing certain colors. There's going to be even more laid back. You go to a metal concert, you're going to get some moshing, if you guys know what moshing is. That's okay if you don't. You're going to be like jumping up against each other and just like, it actually gets violent. It's a little overwhelming for me. It's not my cup of tea. But what we learn from this understanding of culture too is that what we may see as normal may not be normal for someone else. And that's okay. That's just how culture functions. And I love this story. Carl actually told me this story a long time ago. How many of you guys have heard of a guy named Jack Hayford? He's a beautiful Bible scholar. I know the bowlers are Jack Hayford people. David actually grew up in Jack Hayford's church. But what's really cool about him, and I remember this story, is if you watch like a video of Jack Hayford, he usually dresses pretty nice. He doesn't dress like me at all. He usually dresses like a sweater vest or like a blazer or something. But Carl told me this really cool story I thought was awesome. He came to the Vineyard. He was asked to speak at the Vineyard Anaheim when Carl was over there. And what he did, the first thing he did is he went to a thrift store to buy a Hawaiian t-shirt. And the reason he did that is he was willing to sacrifice what was his norm, his way of doing things. And that's really what a norm is. It's our way of doing things. It's how we think that it's supposed to go always. But for him, he was willing to put that norm aside so that he could speak the language of his people. I remember even Carl just feeling like, wow, that was so kind of him to be willing to come to our level. Because quite frankly, if you're used to wearing a suit, to wear a Hawaiian shirt when you're preaching is like weird. Like I know I wore a hat last time, and someone had said like, "Hey, that was a great message, but can you not wear a hat next time?" You know? And so and I get it. It's because that's their norm. When you're preaching, you don't wear a hat. You know? I got a haircut, so now I cannot wear a hat, but next time I'll probably wear one. It just happens that way. And the last one here, number 3, is our values. Right? Different cultures value different things. In fact, it's really fascinating. Even the way we view on a broad scale, the elderly. Right? If you were to go to a different country, the idea of even having a retirement home is offensive. Right? To have one is like, how dare you not take care of your parents? Whereas here we go, okay, maybe there's reasons for that though. Maybe we need one. But there it's like, no, there is no reason for that. And that's just a different thing for values, right? Another one would be generational values, right? How we, the values that we carry. So I think that I was listening to this really cool podcast the other day about different generations. There's actually people who spend their whole lives dedicated to researching how different generations function, which is fascinating. I don't know how they do it, but it's amazing. And so someone who's a baby boomer, or a Gen X, which is right below a baby boomer, would really value when looking for a career. At least this is what they're saying. So if you don't believe me, I'm sorry. I'm repeating information here, so if you disagree. But they would really value stability in a job, that there would be a stable income, and that there would be good benefits. Whereas a millennial, who I know you guys all love millennials. Yeah, come on, right? I love millennials because I am one. But millennials, what we really value is creative freedom. We want to make a difference. And that's a value that generation carries. And one of those, neither of those are bad. They're good. They're different expressions of different values that we carry. And I could do a whole nother message on that and how past revival was connecting those generations because both are needed. But that's a different story. But I want to say we have to see that those values, one isn't bad. They're both good. And so in order to do this, to even connect these here, I want to look at Daniel and Paul again. I want to go back to them. And Daniel's really going to be our prime example because he was completely thrown into a different culture where he had to learn those things every day. He had to learn how to speak the language. He had to do all these things we're talking about, the different aspects of culture. And Daniel, quite frankly, I'll get into that in a sec. But number one on your notes here on the handout is that we need to become students of our culture. We need to learn of our culture. And Daniel literally became a student of his culture, and that wasn't by choice. He just had to do it. But it worked out in his favor anyway. And and I want to say again, as we said this earlier, he never lost his true identity. He never lost who he was, but he did learn to speak the language of his people. He did learn to do that by becoming a student. And I love this quote, and I think it'll pop up there for you as well. This is by a pastor named Timothy Keller, and I think he's in New York, but he says, "The first step in becoming all things to all men is to understand and as much as possible identify with your listeners, the people you are seeking to reach. This begins with a diligence and never-ending effort to become as fluent in their social, linguistic, and cultural reality as possible." And this guy is a smart guy, as you can probably tell. So it involves learning to express people's hopes, objections, fears, and beliefs so well that they cannot do it or express it better themselves. And I think we need to ask ourselves, do we know those things about the people we want to reach? Do we know their fears? Do we know their objections? Do we know their concerns? Are we willing to listen to those things? And the second quote that I have that I think is beautiful by him as well is it says, "Christianity demands that we have enough compassion to learn the questions of our generation." I like that one a lot. I do want to read it again. "Christianity demands that we have enough compassion to learn the questions of our generation." Sometimes the way that we can love and honor the best is by listening. It's by asking questions. What matters to the people that I want to reach? What are the concerns they have? What are the stumbling blocks in the way of them hearing the gospel? Because if you ask, people have a reason oftentimes. Now, I live with a guy who's really processing these things right now, and he has some valid concerns. But if I didn't ask, I would never know. And I would just assume that he's just out there going crazy. But he's not. He wants to know the real Jesus. And there's things that have gotten in the way and kind of muddied that water, so to speak. And so we have to be willing to do that. So number 2 here, honor and respect even those we disagree with. I think Daniel is a legend of this, but even before I get to Daniel, I think Peter said it best in 1 Peter 2:17. It's really simple. He says, honor everyone. That simple. Honor everyone. And he didn't say this, I'm adding this, but even those we disagree with. It was just implied with everyone. And it's amazing because Daniel, and I don't understand Daniel. Honestly, when I read Daniel, he's crazy. The things that he does, his perspectives, his heart posture, my prayer is that one day I could be like Daniel. Because the first thing, if you want to see honor, it's insane. He gets thrown in the lion's den to be killed. That's the assumption. These lions are hungry, and we're going to throw him in there. Unjustly, by the way. He did nothing wrong. The advisors to the king created a plan so that they could get rid of him because they didn't like the favor he had with the king. That was the whole plan. They throw him in the lion's den. God shuts the mouths of the lions. He's alive. Next day, the king comes in and says, "Are you alive?" And Daniel responds, and I love this, "May the king live forever." my response would be, screw you, teen, get out of here. But first I would get out and then say that, maybe give him a little kick or something. But that's insane. The ability to actually love someone who's different than you. And not only that, a total jerk. Like, dude's an a-hole. Like, for a lack of a better way of saying it, he's just not a nice guy. And this guy was known for this. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't say that from the pulpit. But that was the truth of it. This guy, and somehow, he learned to love someone who had different values than him. He learned to see Jesus' hand on people's lives. He learned to see from his heart. And I think this one actually is something that we really need to learn to do well, that we would honor and love even those we disagree with. And I think there's so many examples. I think of practical ones, right? We have politics. It is very easy to begin to slander people in politics. That when we don't agree with someone, we lose all honor, respect, and love. It goes right out the door. And so that's a very practical way that we can begin to speak highly of people even we disagree with. Because the truth is, and it may be a controversial thing, but I think most politicians are trying to do their best. We may not agree with them, but they want to see change in the best way possible. And even if they don't, we still, guess what? We have a command to pray for those in leadership. And we get to honor those people who disagree with us. You may be a Republican or a Democrat. Guess what? Jesus loves both. And you're also allowed, this is a side note, I probably shouldn't say these things either. These things I'm passionate about. You're allowed to be a Christian and a Democrat too. What? It's allowed. You're allowed to have beliefs in those ways. Now, there's certain things why, never mind. I'm not going there. It's not worth it. But how about this one? Generations, right? There seems to be a thing where we like to bash different generations. I hear it a lot against millennials, but I've heard millennials say like, baby boomers don't get it. Or like you see memes going around like, boomer. There's memes about it now. But even with the older generation looking at us, I know there's been even concerns of, you guys just don't get it, you're not gonna make it. But can we learn to love and see the value that different generations bring? And don't get me wrong, again, I wanted to say earlier that both together is really what brings things to fullness. That connecting the generations is where we'll see a move of God. I really believe that. And I so badly want to go down a side rope there, because that's something that, if there was one, no, there's a lot of things I'm passionate about, that's a lie. But if there was another thing that I was really passionate about, it would be connecting generations. There's something about that if we want to see God move, that has to happen. That we have to learn to connect the hearts of fathers and mothers to sons and daughters. It has to happen, and vice versa. And that's just, I'll leave it at that, because I could go down there a long way. And I can't do it. But number 3 is, and it's real simple, refusing to be offended. Right? That we would refuse offense. That when we see something that may, for lack of better words, it's a psychological term, but trigger us, we can choose to not be offended by it. We can choose our response. We're powerful people who have been given a spirit of self-control in how we respond. Because what happens is, if we live offended, we'll refuse to speak the language of the people. If we're offended, we won't speak the language of the people. We'll stop listening, because now what happens is, when we're offended, we've all been there. I've been there. I've been offended a lot. Right? We can get to a place of, I don't want to hear what you have to say. Like, you're mean, like whatever. We get real childish with it. But we stop listening. We don't want to hear what people have to say, because we don't like them now for that minute when we're offended. And what happens then is, we stop loving, and we lose all influence that we might have had or wanted. So we have to learn to refuse offense. And the truth is, our norms, the thing we talked about earlier, I think it was number 2 on that list, create opportunities to potentially be offended. Right? Jack Hayford, he could have been like, how dare you wear that shirt, But not only that, he goes, not only will I not be offended by you wearing a Hawaiian shirt when you preach, which is blasphemy. Maybe it is. Some movements you have to actually, when you preach, you're in a suit. That's how some people see it. But he instead chose to humble himself and wear a Hawaiian shirt to speak the language of the people, which I think was incredible. And Paul actually does this a lot too. If you look, and I'm going to let you do this, I can't dissect this right now, but if you look at the different sermons that Paul preached in Acts, depending on who he spoke to, he actually changed his whole, the way he communicated. When he was speaking to the Jews, he communicated with what he understood their needs to be. And if you looked at all of Paul's letters, he actually understands the language of the people quite a bit. He understands when he's speaking to the Romans that they have a different need, right? Or you hear a lot, the Jews versus the Greeks. There's these contrasts all the time, but he understands the contrast. He understands those things, and so is willing to change. It's fascinating. And so he recognized even, and I'll just do a little bit of it, but with the audience that he was speaking to that wasn't Jewish, he recognized their desire for wisdom. And so from that place, he was able to change the way he communicated and lead people to understand that Jesus is the ultimate wisdom they were looking for, but was willing to change his presentation of the gospel. Now, the gospel didn't change, but how he presented it did. And I think that's something that we need to learn how to do for to reach people. Daniel, I mean, we already looked at him. Dude's a legend. Like, Daniel's a hero of mine. I don't know how you can have such a heart posture that when someone wrongs you to the extreme where you're supposed to die, can say, "King, may you live forever." But he learned how to address royalty. That was something that he had to learn how to do. If he didn't learn how to address royalty, he wouldn't have had the favor and the influence that he had, though God's hand put him in that place. But he still learned how to speak and address kings because he was now in a place that he had to do that if he wanted to have influence and to continue in that influence as well. Because I do believe that God will begin to give us influence in different places, but we also have a responsibility to now learn how to carry that. Right? Jesus grew in favor, right, with God and man, and we have a responsibility to grow in it as well. How do we grow in that? So to end it up here, if there's one thing you hear me say today, is that we need to learn how to put our purpose above our preference. That we would learn to love and honor those around us, no matter what that looks like. That we would choose not to be offended if it looks different than what we prefer, and instead meet people where they're at. To learn to speak the language of a culture, because only when we do that, I believe it, only when we learn to speak their language and we can love and honor them the way they need to be loved and honored, can we gain the influence to lead people to Jesus. And so I want to give you guys an opportunity here to even respond, because this is a big one. It's a little bit harder too, because it literally means sometimes saying no to things that we would prefer. It means saying no to things we've done for years. How we've done things, the way we've done things, why we do things. And the truth is, a lot of us, when we have preferences, it's not like a whole oh man, all willy-nilly, this is my preference. No, we've built a reason for that. Sometimes we even have a theology for why we do things. But the good news is God is bigger than our theology. And he hears a lot about people. He cares a lot about people who need to be reached, and he's asking us. I believe he's inviting us into a place that we would learn to submit those things to prefer other people, that we would remove all stumbling blocks. And so today, I invite you to stand with me if you would, and I want to ask you and actually don't stand yet. Don't do that. Sorry, Aaron. Love you, man. I love your eagerness, man. But I just want to. If you want to commit to this lifestyle, a lifestyle of putting our purpose over our preference, and I want you to think about it for a second, because that is a big deal. And that's actually even what we're trying to do as a church. We're trying to ask the questions of, what does it look like to actually have an impact on Santa Ana? What are the needs that they have? What are the concerns they have? What are the stumbling blocks to them hearing the gospel? And I really believe no matter what you do occupationally, that is a question that we have to learn to ask. If you're a teacher, we have a lot of teachers in this congregation, which is cool, it's crazy. But as a teacher, we have to ask, what are the things in the way of our students, of our coworkers hearing the gospel? In business, what are those things as well? And so as you think about it, Aaron, if you come up and do some worship, man, that's probably why you got up. You weren't eager to do that for me. As we worship, I just want you guys to think about that. And then I'll come back up and I'll give a chance to respond. But think about, do I want to commit to a life that places our purpose over our preference? Is that something that I'm willing to do? Because it takes a conscious choice. And I'll leave it at that.